How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the inaugural episode of Roots2Suits podcast, the podcast aimed at highlighting unique individuals that make up the global cannabis space. My name's Jameson Welbourn. I'm joined by my brother, Graydon Welbourn. And on today's episode, we have our guest, Max Rudsten. Max is currently the co-founder and chief revenue officer of WOVN, a fully licensed cannabis distribution and technology company based in San Fran in LA. My brother and I connected with Max on our last trip down to California for Hall of Flowers. And we're super excited to bring you this episode. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my brother as well as Max Rudsten.
Boys,
Max.
good morning.
Good morning.
Always a pleasure, man. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Always.
We're happy to have you, Max. This is exciting.
So
You guys are the best. I'm glad to be on this thing.
So before we jump into WOVN, what you're currently working on and what you're doing today, we want to kind of take a step back and learn more about what got you to this point. So if you can kind of take us back and give us a little history on Max, where you grew up and what it was like, we'd love to kind of start there and slowly take us through your progression to this industry.
For sure. That's a good question. So grew up in the Bay Area, NorCal, like kind of North Bay, Marin County, which is a pretty like affluent part of the world, like surrounded by incredible nature, lakes, mountains, beaches. Grew up in a pretty great household. Parents got divorced kind of early, around 9 years old. And I only mention that because my parents are like complete opposites. My dad's like the business, finance, make as much money as you can, as fast as you can guy. And my mom's like the more laid back artist, kind of hippie style,
Cool.
influence in my life. And, went on this very kind of interesting path of, because they were divorced, having that influence from my dad on one side and then very isolated and doing it with my mom on the other side. So it was kind of an interesting upbringing, kind of segmenting those two things and then kind of growing up along that same path.
So what was your relationship with cannabis like growing up? Do you remember your first experience?
Absolutely. I mean, everyone growing up always has that friend who has the more lax household, right? The one with like the pool house in the back or something that, can isolate you from the parental unit. So a buddy of mine, you would host these little parties in middle school up at the pool house, right? And the older brother would bring some of this, interesting, green shit over to the party. And I remember smoking it out of an apple, actually. And it was funny. It was like the first time I smoked it, I didn't get high, right? I think that's kind of common for most people. But I was like, this tastes kind of good. So then, the next time we did it again, and that was when it was on, right? We like stumbled down the woods. I remember seeing like flames coming off ice blocks for some reason as a young kid. And from there on, I was like, okay, this is an interesting little inebriate here. So from there, my journey in cannabis, was strong, all the way through kind of high school and to college.
So was that an immediate love connection for you your second time? Was it, oh, okay, this is something that, I need to explore further and right away, or was it something that took a little while to blossom?
It took a little while to blossom, mainly because I didn't know how to get it. It wasn't that accessible where I was at. But it was definitely something that intrigued me and I liked a lot. And then it was in high school really where it started to get, more prevalent part of my life. But yeah, it was always something that was definitely kind of intriguing and interesting and something that I always wanted to be a part of.
Did you have to hide it from your parents?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Your mom too, even though she was the more artsy.
She was the worst of it. She was like, yo, I remember she caught me. I was smoking weed in my room and she wasn't supposed to be home. And she comes home and I had a can of Pepsi or something. You make a can of Pepsi, you smoke it that way. I threw it in the shower and literally just ran into the woods thinking that was going to be the solution. She comes in my room. She's like, what in the fuck is this smell? Grounds me for a month, basically. So no, it was not a situation where the parents were at all excited about my love for cannabis in high school. No.
So during high school, were strain names coming into play, or was it just sort of green bud, kind bud, and things like that?
Yeah, it was mostly green bud, kind bud. I mean, I remember, we used to, as West Coasters, we had the fortune of being able to go to like Kauai and Hawaii, kind of for vacations and things like that. So I remember specifically Maui Wowie was the one that I would always look for, and that's where I would get it. I'd get it over in Hawaii and smoke it out there, but then you could never find it in Cali, right? It was always just like whatever you could find. Yeah, but yeah, Maui Wowie was the first like strain recognition that I had as a kid growing up, for sure.
So after high school, where'd you go to university?
So I decided to skip out of Cali. A lot of my friends were like, "Let's stay in Cali." Everyone likes Cali. I was like, you know what? I want to go on a bit of an adventure. I was super into music. Always like DJing. I was into jazz music. So I started applying to all the Southern schools because I had a deep connection to that kind of musical influence. So decided to go to Tulane University in New Orleans. So popped down there, and just had an incredible time. It was one of those schools where like it was not ranked high because the retention rate was so low, because people would go to New Orleans and just like lose themselves into the
Just
city.
party their face off.
Party their face off. Like I have friends that they come freshman year, the next, sophomore year, they're like shoeless walking through the streets of New Orleans. Like, dude, this is not a good place for you. You got to get the hell out of here. But
What years was that, Max?
so I went there from 2002 to 2006. Right. So
Yeah,
I was actually there. I was actually there when Katrina ripped through. So you remember the big
no way.
Yeah.
So did that affect your schooling then? Do you have to move back, or what happened?
Yeah, so they canceled basically my fall semester of my senior year. But it was always like one of those things in New Orleans, like you always get these hurricane scares, right? So you go to the bars and you look up at the screen, right? And if every time they have like a weather channel on the screen, it's usually an indication that there's something brewing out on the Gulf, right? So I went down there for my senior year, and then literally 2 days later, they were evacuating us, but we would always just like pack a bag for 2 days. We'd go party in like Houston or like, Florida or something like that. This time I packed my bag for 2 days and I didn't go back for like 5 months. Because it was just completely decimated. Yeah.
That's crazy. What did you take at school?
I majored in finance. Yeah, I majored in finance. So like my pops had a pretty big influence on me around like how I needed to navigate university and my degrees. And he was a Wall Street guy. So he worked, New York, he worked, kind of portfolio management, kind of that part of the world. So it was always like, you got to get finance degree, got to make as much money as you can, as fast as you can. So it was always like, okay, finance, let's do this. So that was the major within the business school at Tulane.
Quick question: Did you like that stuff, or were you just mostly doing it to appease dad in a way?
It was definitely to appease dad. Fortunately, he was the one who was paying for my education, right? So that was obviously not leverage, but it was something that was in the back of my brain, right? If he's, telling me that this is something I should consider, then I'm going to take a hard look at that. What was interesting is like through college, right? You start going through the internship, and it was funny. I had this inflection point in my kind of university career where I was like, finance internship in New York, Wall Street, or I actually had the pathway to be on like the shoe design team at Nike. Okay. So I was like choosing between these two like career paths, just like I remember it very clearly. And I remember like, confiding in my dad, hey, like, what do you think? Obviously he's like, go to Wall Street. I was like, okay. And I always kind of remember that time as like, what if I had chose this direction instead of
How did the Nike thing come about?
Honestly, it came about because I was always interested in Nike. I traveled up to like Beaverton, like way back when, and I had always like loved the campus and kind of what was going on up there. We had a family friend that worked at Nike for many years, and I showed a lot of interest in kind of the more like design side of Nike, and that was the influence of my mom, right? So it was the dad influence, Wall Street, mom influence for the Nike job, and that's kind of how it all came together.
So what was the cannabis scene like in New Orleans during your time there?
The cannabis scene was weak, man. It was super weak. I mean, it was interesting coming from Cali and then kind of coming down to this melting pot of human beings from all over the country. And I met a lot of guys from New York specifically, which was kind of a surprise. Like knew Tulane, I was like, oh, like Southern school, going to see a lot of people from Louisiana and Georgia and other places, but a large percentage of people from New York, right? And these guys were kind of different kind of smokers than me. Like when I was smoking weed in Cali, like I was going jumping in the ocean, I was going like hikes, in the wilderness. These guys would just get couch locked and watch Family Guy, right? So it was a little bit of a weird kind of it was weird for me because I was the kind of guy that would like to smoke and get outside. These were the kind of guys that didn't do that, right? So I remember actually taking a break from cannabis because of that, because I didn't enjoy smoking with these kind of guys. And I had to find some different kinds of people. But as far as like the weed was concerned, the weed was like brick weed from Mexico. So it wasn't even like the good stuff that I was getting in Cali, through my high school days.
Yeah, that's very cool. So take us through, you finished school, looking at your LinkedIn, you've had quite an interesting career path, really, really interesting. And the first thing that jumps out is the internship with the marketing internship with the 49ers. How did that come about?
It's just serendipity here. So when I went to Tulane, my dorm roommate was Tony York, who was the son of the owner of the 49ers. So, I mean, talk about privilege. I was just like the guy that was in the right dorm room, right? Became super good friends with Tony and just kind of like went on this journey with him through the 49er organization. And I was always super interested in the sports side of the equation, through my interest in like Nike. And that was like a good kind of internship opportunity to kind of check out the marketing side of football. Ultimately didn't like it. Didn't like the NFL, didn't like the sporting industry. It was highly intense and stressful and honestly really political. And I didn't really enjoy it, to be honest with you.
Interesting. Well, I mean, intense, stressful, political. You made a really move after that. You spent 7 years at JP Morgan. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences that you had there? And
and how you got there.
How you got there, yeah.
Yeah, I was always the guy, like I was like the B+ student, right? I was always the guy that was really like building relationships and kind of digging into that side of my brain. And that's really how I networked my way into an analyst program basically at JP Morgan. And I remember going into these interviews, right? And it's all these like super intense New York Wall Street guys. And I'm just like, yo guys, give me a fucking broom. Give me a broom. I will go in here, I'll sweep the floors. I don't care. I don't care what I do. Get me in the door. I promise you, I'll work my ass off and I will be successful and make your business better. That's literally the tactic that I did when going into these interviews. And it worked. It was just like, who is this guy? He's passionate. He wants to get to work. He wants to roll up his sleeves. And, that's what I think positioned me to get the job, alongside, counterparts from Yale and Harvard and, all these other schools. I guess Tulane's kind of like I call it the Harvard of the South, but anyway, that's how I jumped in.
So did you move to New York or were you in Cali at this time?
Yeah. So right after school, moved to New York.
Okay.
So moved to Manhattan. I was on the private banking side in the beginning, and then I kind of moved my way over to the investment bank. And on the investment bank side, I was doing something called sales trading. So I was working on the desk, right, like doing the trading and the sales for large kind of big institutional players. And I moved out to the West Coast to help manage a book of business on the West. And this was actually when the financial crisis was just starting to kind of bubble, right? So what was fascinating is that during that time, all the people that were way more expensive than me were getting canned and fired, right? And it was just this young kid, me, the one that was working hard, that had a lot of opportunity. So I took over a pretty large book of business on the West Coast as like a mid-20-year-old and was successful in doing it. Hated it, always hated it, but it was like, holy shit, this is my path. This is what I've devoted my education to. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. But it was always painful to wake up and do it. And what was also painful about waking up is I had to wake up at 3:30 in the morning because we were working New York hours. So I was waking up early, working 12 hours a day, going to sleep at 7:30 at night, and then partying.
I was going to say, why did you
hard.
hate it? But I feel like that must be the reason.
Yeah, it was that was a huge reason, but it was also just the culture and the people. It was all about profit and revenue and money and this and that. And I never resonated with that side of Wall Street. It was incredibly powerful, the education I got, right? Working for a huge institution like that and kind of navigating the different departments and really like having a stressful job, managing a ton of revenue. But I never woke up like excited about doing it. And I would honestly, the weekends is when I would smoke a shit ton of weed or drink too much alcohol just to forget about the week ahead, you know?
Yeah, what was the cannabis scene like in New York at that time? Because we asked about New Orleans. I want to ask about New York.
Yeah, the cannabis scene was it's all about that sour D out in New York. So I remember that was the strain I was smoking all the time out there. And kind of sativa lean. So I was, I would go and kind of jump around the city and have some fun with it. But wouldn't do it, at work or after work. It was mostly like weekends is when I would kind of dive in.
I think it's super, it speaks volumes to your personality and your values that you were able to walk away from a role like that. And the reason that I can speak to it is not only do I have family members who are investment bankers and I know what the first 10 years are like, but I did the first 5 years of commercial real estate and then walked away from my own portfolio that was just, turning over. And those first 5 to 7 years in industries like that, you get completely stepped on. And that's just the way it is because the guys before them got stepped on and the guys before them got stepped on. And so I think that, it truly speaks to your value system that, you were able to leave a 7-year successful career in iBanking to move on to something else. And, moving into that, when you made that decision to leave, was that sparked by any major event or was that a culmination of many small events?
It's a really good question. I mean, for me, it was this constant battle with myself, in a role like that, where I didn't know where I belonged, right? So it was this tormenting existence. So it was just this like slow build, not really knowing what I was fighting. And then it was in 2013, January 2013. I'm super into like underground house music, things like that. So I was, that was a big part of my kind of release was going out and playing music. And there was a festival down in Playa del Carmen called BPM Festival. I went down there and I just like lost my mind, had a blast. And I remember I was just like on a beach. It was a sunset and everyone was just dancing and having so much fun and laughing. And I just like, I'd never seen so much happiness all concentrated in like one place. And I just started like crying. I was just like, this is like utopia right here. And I cannot enjoy this knowing that I have to go back to the whatever it is that I'm doing.
Yeah.
So literally I made the decision on the beach that day that I was going to quit my job the next week. Flew back home. This was after my bonus cleared and all that. And I just quit. And within the next, call it 6 weeks, I was on a one-way flight to Asia.
Whoa, that's a great story. I love that.
That's awesome. First of all, were you listening to the music or creating the music?
I was a DJ, so I was still a DJ, but I, just
cool.
Yeah. So just I was curating the music. I'd made music growing up. I was in a jazz band and stuff like that. What's my DJ name?
Yeah.
That's Cool Face.
Okay. Awesome. That's awesome.
Okay. Makes sense now.
Yeah. Also his IG. So if you want to look him up.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. If you're ready for looking to do the mind of a deranged human, you can check me out on Instagram.
One of the most entertaining.
A great account, Max.
Thank you.
Like we were kind of friends when we left California, and me following your account actually allowed me to peer inside of your mind, which is very rare. People share that way. And I literally went from like, yeah, he's a good, like, to, yo, this is a spirit animal brother of mine.
Oh, that's so sweet, man.
I do the same things as you. I just might not share them. So I just nothing but a ton of love for your IG. But
thanks, bro. Appreciate you.
so how long were you in Asia, and how long till your first entrepreneurial idea came about? Because you're not just doing cannabis, you've got a couple of other things that you tried out and are currently working on as well.
Yeah. So for me, like I had this side of my brain. I like to call it like the mom side of my brain, right? That creative side of my brain. It was literally like inching towards atrophy in this iBanking job, right? So the release, like the ripcord that I pulled to get out of finance, kind of like revived that side of my brain because I didn't have all this weight and burden of the job on top of it, right? So for me, I went out to Asia to enjoy it, right? But also to like recalibrate my brain, and then also just like start focusing on like what can I create, what can I build. And when I got out there, I was really interested in kind of thinking through what type of tangible product business I could build, right? So something that I could actually like hold in my hand. And you know, that was something I was missing as an iBanker, right? It was like you were just pushing paper around, making wealthy people more wealthy, but you never could hold anything in your hand in that business, right? So for me, it was like, what can I create that I can hold in my hand? And the first thing that I thought of was a distilled spirits business. And if you guys are familiar with a category called Fernet, it's basically an Italian digestif, right? And in San Francisco specifically, this is like a really funky story, but we supposedly drink 40% of the import from Italy, right? It's got this cult following in San Francisco. And at that time, it was like 2013-ish. You know, San Francisco is like this craft, you know, kind of boutique crafty city where you're kind of like leaning into local. And, you know, we drank 40% of this Italian import, but we didn't have our own, right? So then I started thinking like, well, if we're such a big drinker of this stuff, why don't we create the first domestic, first local San Francisco Fernet? So I literally got back from Asia. I was in Asia for about like 2 months or so. And I came back and I started kind of diving deep into the bowels of the internet, just going on to like distillation blogs and in Italian, and picking out herbs and botanicals that, you know, I'd never heard before, and starting to just catalog them. And I started ordering them online, and I started tinkering with all these herbs in my buddy's backyard. We started infusing them in different mediums and coming up with just different concoctions. And we made some really, really nasty shit, but we made some good shit too. So I was like, how do I make this commercially viable? I needed to partner with like a distillation group. So I got a partner to help me kind of refine it and make it commercially viable, raised a little bit of money, and got it off the ground in one of the more highly, you know, regulated supply chains, you know, in the world. So that was a huge, you know, learning experience, and one of the reasons why I actually kind of then got into cannabis.
One question: How long was that?
How long was the kind of the tinkering in the backyard brewing? That was about 6 months of that. 6 months of that until I said, okay, I need to get some partners in here, and I need to actually like find some people that know what the hell they're doing. And then it was kind of in, you know, 2014 was when we really started like putting, you know, business plan to paper, pen to paper, and getting everything going and set up.
So was it the essential oils side and the exploring and curating that inventory of spices that pivoted you back to look at cannabis, or what was it about that project that made you lean back into cannabis?
Yeah, it was less about that. I mean, it was definitely, it was a little of that. What it was mostly on was building a brand and a business. And you know, I had always been deeply interested in cannabis. I had some friends who I grew up with who were always, you know, on the cuspies, right? They weren't the ones who were going through a corporate path. They were, you know, how do we grow weed and make money, right? So, you know, after I graduated college, I would like come down to Santa Cruz, and my buddies would have these houses. They were growing weed and transforming these houses in the hills of Santa Cruz. And then my good buddy Max, actually another Max, who's still in the industry, he, you know, moved up to a place called Grass Valley, was like growing, you know, weed in this utopian society. And I was like, this is incredible. But anyway, a separate group of partners had some cultivation assets, and they saw the success of me standing up this distillation business, and the brand I was kind of putting behind it. And they approached me to be a partner in their business and bring some business structure to what they were doing in the old Prop 215 market. And then help them build a brand around their dad, who is this like legacy kind of mythological cultivator. He had fled California in the early 70s and actually started a hippie commune on the North Shores of Kauai called Taylor Camp. Tons of literature on it. There's a coffee table book. There's a documentary.
What's his name?
Ken May is his name.
Cool.
And the Taylor Camp is just this really crazy story, right? Like, there's pictures of him riding naked on horseback to go, tend to the seeds in the riverbeds of the jungle, right? So they're growing weed in the jungle. They're playing naked volleyball. They're surfing. And I'm just like, yo, I've been working for a bank for 7 years. Like, this is the shit that I need to get into, right? So they brought me in as a partner, and they said, okay, let's do this. So then I started kind of going on this really interesting parallel path where I was building this business and brand in a really kind of regulated alcohol supply chain. And then I was doing the same kind of thing in a really like unregulated, cowboy supply chain.
And so what were your biggest struggles there? Like, what were some things that translated from alcohol into this new foray, and what were some things that absolutely didn't translate during those 215 times?
Oh, during the 215 times, it was a total shit show, right? I mean, it wasn't like I couldn't really take any learnings from like regulated movement of goods at that time. It was mostly on the brand stuff. So how do I create a brand that resonates with the consumer? The brand that we built for the cannabis side was called Family Tree, because this guy, Ken May, he had his two sons. They were an integral part of the business. So we named the brand Family Tree. And because, tree is a term for cannabis as well, right? So it was just a really kind of cool story. And so it was mostly the branding stuff that I could bring over from alcohol at that time. It wasn't until cannabis became legal that then I could start to bring in a lot of the alcohol learnings to the new, more regulated part of cannabis.
Absolutely. And so how long did that last while you were working on this brand?
Yeah. So this was like 2013 is when I started getting kind of more involved with these guys. 14 is when it became a little bit more, more firm in kind of my place in the business. And then from 2014 to 2017, I had built a pretty sizable, cultivation portfolio in different parts of California. So we were in Shasta primarily, and then we moved up to Nevada County. We had a project in Lake County. And then in 2017, one of my big commercial farms, right? It was raided by the local law enforcement agency. So I went up there, like this was like probably 3 or 4 days before harvest. We got over there a few days later, and everything had been chopped down. So that was a huge wake up call, right? Because you had this situation at that time, 2017, where state was like, we're good. Local jurisdictions were like, we're not good. And then it was this constant kind of battle between those two worlds. So we were totally buttoned up by the state, but the local enforcement they'd passed an ordinance more recently, and then all of a sudden it was kind of just like war, right?
Yeah.
So that was the point in time where I was like, okay, I need to focus on being a fully licensed operator, especially with 2018 right around the corner, and that's really where it started to kind of move into this idea of distribution and kind of what I'm working on today.
And so let's talk a little bit more about how that sort of came about. What need did you see in the market at that time that you were addressing?
Yeah, so my other co-founder, JJ, he's incredible. He came from technology integration, so he has a ton of experience in technology and kind of working across different supply chains. But he had a big piece of property up in Humboldt. If you guys have been to Cali, if you guys have been to Regia and the River, they bought a parcel where that used to be hosted, right? And he bought it with a bunch of guys that really wanted to start doing more music festivals. But naturally, when you buy a place in Humboldt, 1,000 acres or whatever, you're going to start growing weed on there, right? So JJ got really involved in that, and we kind of got to know each other along the way. There was a big festival up there that I used to play up at called Northern Nights. So I gave JJ a ride up there. I told him what I was doing on the cannabis side. He told me what he was doing. So we stayed pretty close on each other and what we were doing. And then when the raid happened, we reconnected and I said, listen, man, I want to do something fully licensed. And he's like, I'm working on something that we should all be talking about. And for me, it was really interesting to solve problems in distribution, right? Because of how much I hated working with distributors in the alcohol market. I thought, we're building a new supply chain. We don't have to create distribution to mirror what alcohol does because it's so antiquated, it's so slow, it puts brands on their back feet. So what we wanted to
just to pause you there, for people listening who aren't in California, can you explain a little bit about how it works in California with alcohol distribution?
Yeah, with alcohol distribution. So it's a three-tiered model, right? So if you're a manufacturer, right, or a producer, you then have to sell to a distributor, and then that distributor then has to sell that to a retailer, right? And the issue with that is you have to work with these mostly these large distribution houses with large sales teams, with huge portfolios, right? So for me as a brand that was small, trying to be medium, I would sell my booze to a distributor and then I would expect them to go sell it, but they wouldn't sell it. I had to go sell it. I had to go hire people to go sell it. I had to go hit the ground and sell it myself, right? But I still had to pay my distributor 35%, right? They made more per bottle than I made as the brand, which is just incredible, right? And you're forced to work in these structures where you're really relying on other people to sell your product, and you pay them to do it, but they don't do it. So for us in cannabis, when we came together on the distribution side, we're like, let's flip that on its head. What did I not get as a brand in alcohol that I would have really appreciated and needed to grow my business? And one of the first things I said was, I need a technology platform to help connect myself to this vast amount of retailers so I can have that direct connection with that buyer, right? So we really came together and said, we want to be a technology forward, basically logistics business, right? Where brands have the power to go sell to whoever they want, and we're the ones who provide the platform to connect with those retailers, and then we're the ones doing all the heavy lifting, getting it picked, packed, and shipped, and then all the cash collected and then back to them, right? The other thing I missed in alcohol was I didn't get any data. I didn't get any actionable insights. I would sell my booze to these distributors, and I'd get a depletion report, 60 days later. Hey, we sold them to these accounts. It's like, thanks, guys. Like, I wish I knew that, like, when you sold it, so I could go run a social campaign, or I could go drop them with some merch or whatever, right? So it was this really, like, I was always on my back feet, right? I was the last to get paid. I was the first to have to pay out. And it was just this really, really shitty dynamic that really put brands in my position in a place of just not being able to scale.
Absolutely. So how did you, using that tech side, how did you lay out WOVN to be different?
Yeah, so came down to my two partners, right? So JJ and now my other partner Con. They have a ton of experience in technology, kind of navigating supply chains. They work for a big kind of technology integrator. So JJ managed the Apple book of business. So when Apple was standing up, multiple retail shops in like Hong Kong and Brazil and Europe, his company would stand up warehouse fulfillment infrastructure in those local regions, right? They would intake all the wireless and hardware, and then they would distribute it to activate these shops, right? And when you're operating over country lines, there's a ton of regulation, a ton of compliance. So the supply chains are really kind of difficult to navigate. So they had a lot of experience kind of setting up those transactions, setting up tech to help navigate those different supply chains. And look at cannabis, right? It's the most highly regulated, industry in the world, right? So you could take a lot of those learnings from that business and apply them to cannabis. So Con really looked at the California kind of regulatory framework, and he started architecting the tech to really flow with those regulations to be the most compliant engine possible, right? And then it was kind of my insight on like, what do the brands need? How do we solve problems for the brands, coupled with the architecture of the tech, to then make sure that we're giving the brands the tools they need while staying, incredibly compliant in a really regulated supply chain.
So what year did you, was the inception of WOVN, and how did it go your first year? What were some of the biggest hurdles you were facing?
Yeah, so 2017 is when we basically bootstrapped. We bought some real estate, and what was really, I guess, serendipitous about that whole engagement is because JJ, my partner, had a Humboldt County collective set up. He set it up with his San Francisco address. So when he set it up, you could say we were pre-existing. And in San Francisco in 2017, if you could prove that you were a pre-existing operator in the city of San Francisco, you got grandfathered into the permitting program, right? We didn't have to go through any kind of equity programs or anything. It was just like, that's our business. We were pre-existing. Let's do this thing. So that was super powerful. We needed real estate. So we bootstrapped. We got some real estate down in the Bayview district of San Francisco. And that's how we were able to get the license, right? So 2017 is when we purchased the first warehouse unit. And then in 2018, our first legal sale in the cannabis supply chain was in March of 2018. And believe it or not, it was THC infused sexual lubricant. That was our first sale. I delivered $500 worth of THC sex lubricant to a shop in San Francisco in JJ's hatchback Infinity.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah, what was it like during that first year, during that startup year?
Yeah, it was exciting. I mean, I'll be honest with you, it was super exciting. I think classic cannabis, right? Classic cannabis, there's so much opportunity, especially when you're building something from the ground up. You can get distracted, right? So we had this Humboldt farm we were trying to activate. So we got a little distracted there, but like really on the distribution side, it was a shit show back then. I mean, it wasn't until July of 2018 where people actually had to work with distributors. I don't know if you guys are kind of familiar with how that all went through, but I think it was July of 2018 where they said, everything has to be, child resistant packaging. Everything has to be labeled the right way. Everything cuts off right here, right? Has to be go through a distribution license. And that was really when the business took off, is when they were like, okay, these guys have a licensed warehouse. They have a compliant engine. Let's start working with these guys. But it wasn't without a ton of headache, right? Because it was still the Wild West. You had brands that were coming in, they were leaving. You couldn't get any contracts done. No one was signing any deals. So it was just like the revolving door of like different types of groups that you kind of had to feel out. Obviously, I had a lot of like legacy relationships, but those honestly weren't the relationships that were like super successful in a new like legal supply chain. So that was really tough to navigate. I'm always been about, the farmers and trying to help farmers through these supply chains. But that was really challenging because you're working with, a bunch of different small farms. So it was definitely a challenge, and it was all while we're building the tech too, right? Like we're building the plane as we're kind of flying it. So that was super challenging, but huge learning experience.
And so as you've seen the market mature and 215 go into 64, like what challenges lay in front of you today that not necessarily were in front of you in 2018?
The challenges that we see sitting where we sit is, there's just a lot of consolidation, right? A lot of consolidation that's happening across the industry, across different verticals of the industry, right? So obviously when consolidation happens, bigger companies emerge, right? So, we've been successful because of how scrappy we are, right? We've been really successful because we're really solutions oriented. When we see issues in the market, we solve those issues. We build that into our SOPs. We build that into the tech. But the challenge is that these companies, they keep getting bigger, right? So how do you continue to compete? And as a distributor, it's capital intensive, right? When we get more business in the door, I need more trucks. I need more warehouse space, right? So it's a challenge to compete, at that level. But what's cool about our business is we have this technology, right? So now that we've built the tech to really manage our entire business, we now are in a place where we can start to license that out to bigger consolidated companies, right? So we built everything on the Salesforce infrastructure, if you guys are familiar with that. And how most of our brands use it today is, they have a portal, right? So they log into their portal. They're able to, connect with retailers in our network. They're able to submit orders, track orders through their life cycle, download sales and insights, regional insights on kind of go-to-market strategy. So there's a lot of like good, useful data that brands get out of the system. But what's powering that is the ERP that we built, right? And now that we've been building that and learning and developing for the last 4 years, we're now at a place where this ERP is really, really powerful, and we can now start to license it out to other partners, which I think is a different strategy than some of our other competitors. And our goal there is if we can get this technology in the hands of other groups, we're all going to speak the same language, right? So then the collaboration becomes more seamless across supply chain partners. You look at like how we stood up LA, right? So LA is a great like kind of microcosm example. We don't own the warehouse, we don't own the license, right? But we were able to deploy our tech, stand that up on our network, and then we were able to get all the physical inventory over there. We were able to deploy our resources, our trucks, our drivers, warehouse, QA, all that. But we didn't actually have to own the warehouse or the license, right? So it's a powerful tool to be able to stand up infrastructure and hubs without actually having to like put the capital into building all those things out. Because in Cali right now, there's a shit ton of underutilized infrastructure that's not being monetized. It's all licensed. It's just we have to find it, deploy the tech, activate it, and then we create a healthier ecosystem and healthier supply chain.
I think there's a lot of parallels to be drawn on that aspect from California to Canada, because you're seeing a lot of guys come in and get creative now and understand that you don't necessarily need a facility and a license in your name to do what you're trying to do. And it's about that creative thinking and looking at things a little bit differently to be able to come in and grow from what is the carcass of these less efficient businesses. So, I think that that's a really refreshing way to look at it.
Do other distributors, like do your other competitors, are they also building out tech, or is this something sort of novel that you guys thought to do because of the type of partners that you brought in? Like, is that typical or no?
It's interesting. If you look at like the distribution landscape, right? Like there's certain competitors of ours that, are large and they are adopting, different ERP solutions that were very, powerful in other industries, right? But I think what a lot of these companies are realizing is that if you're adopting tech that was built for another industry for cannabis, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you have to create the tech, in our opinion. When we looked at out of the box solutions when we were first getting our business going, nothing was flexible or nimble enough for us to scale. So we knew really early that we had to build it to be competitive and to add value to our customers, right? There are groups that are building tech. They're probably doing it out of necessity rather out of like commercial viability. It seems like they're doing it to run their business, but they're not thinking about it as like a licensing, like to license it out. But I would say if you're not a tech company in the next 20 years, then you're probably not a business, right? I mean, in the next 20 years, you have to have a technology tilt to survive. And that's really what we're leaning into.
Very cool. Thanks for that. James, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask about your outlook on the industry as a whole in California. Do you foresee the more dark days ahead, or do you think that the clouds are opening up as far as solutions for an embattled industry?
Yeah, it's been super challenging. I think obviously everyone is looking at the tax, the overburdens and tax structure. So how we can alleviate those burdens to help give different operators a better shot at succeeding. So I think it needs to start. It needs to start there. I think we need to get the state more opened up from a retail standpoint. I think we have less than 1,000 licensed retailers based on the supply that's pumping through the system right now. They say that you need closer to 3,000 to 4,000 to be able to gobble up all that supply. So, and it's less about, putting 50 more in Santa Rosa or something like that. It's about looking at jurisdictions in California that don't have cannabis right now and need to stand cannabis up, so like excited about like Fresno. Fresno is a town that's going to go bonkers, right? Because they're, big consumers down there. And that wasn't a part of the state that had cannabis, right? So I think we need a lot more retail, and I think we need to alleviate the very overburdensome tax structure to make sure that this is a healthier industry going forward.
What are you seeing on the retail front as far as trends with the consumer? Are you seeing the consumer leaning more towards convenience and price point, or are Californians as more seasoned cannabis consumers starting to demand higher quality products?
Yeah, so there's two worlds, right? There's like the value buyer, right? And then there's the one who, they reach for the extraordinary and they're willing to pay the premium for that, right? And it's interesting. There was a study that tracked the movements of consumers over like a 10-year span across different countries. And it's interesting to note that like those types of consumers fall into one of those two buckets, and they rarely move from one to the other, right? So what's really fascinating about cannabis is it hasn't quite matured enough for that to really hold true, right? It feels like brand loyalty isn't really a thing right now. It's like I talked to my brother-in-law over the weekend, and he basically buys whatever the retailer wants to sell him, right? He doesn't care about brand. I'm like, what brand are you buying? He's like, I don't know. I'm just buying whatever. So it's kind of an interesting world we're living in right now. But I would say the future of cannabis will be that reach for the extraordinary, right? And there's always going to be the value side. There's always going to be the Paxstones of the world where it's like a McDonald's cheeseburger. It's not the best cheeseburger in the world, but every time you go to McDonald's, you know exactly what kind of cheeseburger you're going to get, right? And I think that's really prevalent in California. But as far as trends are concerned, like super excited to see like rosin, kind of making a push through here, and how we can start to really commercialize that in a way that it's all about getting it to the market in a really like effective way, and not degrading the quality and things like that. So I think as the industry is maturing, you'll start to see more categories that that kind of hit that premium point.
Are you seeing more distros and retailers adopting cold chains to sort of honor those products and the integrity of those products? And is Woven one of them?
Yeah, so we need to do that. We need to invest in the cold transport, the cold storage to make sure that those products, that brand message is all the way through to the consumer. So we just like installed all these new sensors in our vans where you can always track the temperature of the vans. And I think it's a really cool story if we can start to kind of integrate that into the tech to say, when we pick this up from our manufacturing partner, it never went over this temperature all the way through to the retail delivery, right? So there's things like that we're working on. As far as like infrastructure is concerned, it's kind of a brand by brand thing. So if there's brands that, require it, need it, then we kind of invest in it as an investment in the partnership. Yeah.
What are some of the brands that you're currently working with?
We have a pretty good portfolio. Like we have a pretty like diverse portfolio right now. I mean, I'm a super big fan of Ball Family Farms. I think they're just this authentic social equity brand out of LA. A guy, Chris Ball, has a really, really fascinating story. He's just a really fascinating individual. He's, been growing weed in South Central for a long time. Was one of the first social equity applicants, got a license, and is all about family and authenticity, and they grow really interesting strains. So I really like them. Everything coming out into Natura is super interesting, like the Fidel stuff, the Jelly Wizards, right? So all the legacy stuff kind of making its way through the legal market, which I love to see. THC Design is one of my favorite, flower brands out of LA that we support. So the list goes on, but yeah, those are kind of the main ones that just popped in my brain.
So let me ask you this. In early days of legalization, were there a lot of rumblings that legacy brands wouldn't be able to translate into the legal space? Because my experience in Canada was there was very much a messaging that, legacy brands are not going to be able to transfer into the legal space. And now we're 3 years in, and it's almost that the legacy brands have more equity than the brands created in the legal space. And legal companies are now looking to go out and find their legacy brand that they can then acquire and bring in. And I see that being done in a much more larger, grandiose scale in California. And I wanted to know, in the early days, were there feelings that you wouldn't be able to leverage these assets that were created in a different market into this new market?
Yeah, it's a really really good question. I mean, I think in the beginning, everyone was focused on like cannabis 2.0 before we even had cannabis 1.0. So everyone's like, let's launch this new like slick, sophisticated, packaging and brand. And honestly, like the consumer market just wasn't sophisticated enough to really care about that at that stage, right? So like I think that was a huge misstep by a lot of folks that thought differently. I mean, the legacy brands are the ones who built the industry, right? They're the ones who built it. So for me, it's super exciting to see groups that were legacy kind of come through the legal market. And it's, it's a certain type of consumer, right, that wants that kind of thing. But it kind of reminds me of like a Supreme, right? Like the Supreme has that exclusivity. You drop it and you go get it, and you look forward to that drop. You'll wait in line at Cookies Maywood for whatever that looks like. So I'm excited to see, those brands, garnering more equity in the supply chain, and frankly, like crushing it over, the well-funded, company out of Colorado that's trying to break into California. So.
Absolutely. And buying bulk flower from another large scale greenhouse producer and then rebranding it and putting their package on it. Like, I mean, it was really interesting for me, getting to experience all these conferences and events in Cali, and going to some of the bigger ones like Hall of Flowers and talking to some of these booths. And, I'm very close to the cannabis plant. And so my first question is like, how do you guys grow? Like, what medium are you growing in to create this flower? And a lot of these brands that are popping up, they're like, oh bro, I don't know. We buy this flower. Like we don't even grow it. And I'm like, you should know how it's grown. And so I think that the disconnection of some of these brands from the actual source of where it's coming from, it might work with well-managed branding and, for people not as connected to the plant, I think it works really well, but there will be a segment of the industry that won't associate with that. Like, are you seeing a push towards less shiny Mylars and more quality inside the packaging from a segment of the market that you're seeing from a 50 from a bird's eye view? Are you seeing that push, or is it all about, fancy indoor cannabis in a metallic Mylar bag?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to, as you're building a brand, right, especially in a supply chain like this where it's so hyper competitive, and you're going to lose a consumer if they have one bad experience. They're going to go to the next thing, right? So I think like too often it's either companies are focused too heavily on the shiny package and not enough on the quality. And it's like death by 1,000 cuts. It's like if you buy a Louis Vuitton bag and the zipper doesn't work, you're probably going to buy a Louis Vuitton bag again, but it's not going to be a great experience. In cannabis, if you do that, you're not going to buy that brand again, right? It's just not going to happen. I think that we're in a place now where brands need to focus on the full picture before bringing things to market, but it needs to start with the quality. It needs to start with the quality of the flower. And I think the brand story will resonate from there. It's just a shame when you go into a store and you see this beautiful package and you open up the jar and it's just this like stuff that they bought 6 months ago, and it's just this it's nothing that you want to smoke, right? And you spent $50-$60 on that eighth. So leaning into quality, I think, is where people are starting to really focus on, rather than the shiny package.
Yeah, and I mean, the amount of supply, the oversupply, it will drive the access to quality up, and unfortunately the price down for farmers. And a lot of people are leaving and looking for opportunities in other states right now. There's a bit of an exodus of the what I think is the brain trust of real California cannabis that's happening right now. Is that being felt at all on your end of things, or is there just still so much activity in the market that it hasn't been noticed as of yet?
I feel like when you're in Cali, you're in this knife fight. I haven't really heard of a ton of people within my circles looking to leave. I had some really dear friends, get really big jobs at like MSOs, that are, in Chicago and things like that. But as far as just like people leaving California because of just the fuckery of California, I haven't quite seen that in mass exodus yet. At the end of the day, this is the biggest, cannabis market in the world. If you can be successful here, you can be successful anywhere. So I think people are really like doubling down and just trying to, get that done.
Was there anything that you brought from Wall Street to cannabis? I know, because it was kind of like such a grind and a slog for you, but was there anything that you took from those days that you found surprisingly useful, or maybe not? I don't know, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Wall Street, you learn, you learn the foundations of business, finance. Those are all things that you could bring over, maybe kind of indirectly. For me, it was always about, the type of people that I had to deal with, and engage with and do business with were high octane people, right? So I had to be polished. I had to bring a level of professionalism to every engagement, within the Wall Street community. And I bring that same type of professionalism to, how I operate in cannabis, which I think for a lot of people is refreshing. There's unfortunately a lot of people in cannabis that maybe don't have that business, acumen, and sometimes that can kind of leak over into certain types of deals and certain types of decisions. For me, it was really kind of bringing, the pedigree of JP Morgan to all my business engagements, and just bringing like the integrity. And I think that was one of the things that kind of separated me from a lot of the kind of typical Wall Street people. Is I was this kind of goofy California kid, that liked just doing good business and being really trustworthy. And that's the same type of stuff that I bring to the cannabis market.
I mean, I think it's so valuable. I see it all the time. I mean, I'm very thankful to, have had parents who, when I said I'm just going to grow weed for a living, they, steered me, at least for a time away from it. And I got a lot of experience in the corporate world, not to the extent of Wall Street, but, I deal with a lot of corporate guys and I deal with a lot of legacy guys. And sometimes I'm connecting the two groups, and sometimes I make the introduction and I'm CC'd on the email and I'm, hey, I'd like to introduce you to so-and-so, please set up a meeting. And then the response that I, from the legacy guys, like, yeah, you can just hit me on my cell whenever. And I'm like, these guys are, and I appreciate that maybe they haven't had the experience, but there has to be a bit of respect, that there needs to be a balance between corporate and legacy. And I mean, that's what this podcast is about, is highlighting unique individuals from across the gamut, whether, it's, you've never smoked a joint and you're running a head of a publicly traded company, or, you've never gotten off the hill and you just grow fire all your life because your dad grew it and taught you how to grow it. That's the gambit we want to run. But I think when you're doing business in this industry, there's a line in the sand we all have to meet at, and a bit of formality and professionalism is not selling out. It's just meeting everybody at a commonality where we can communicate at the same level. Because, there are guys that if you respond to them and you're just like, yeah, man, just hit me on my cell whenever, period. No, that's just not, they're going to never call you.
Right.
So I think that that's super valuable to have in this industry, because, as much as we want to be like, listen, we can't take ourselves too seriously. We're selling weed. We have to have some fun. There has to be a level of professionalism so we all can communicate it and talk amongst each other, because until that communication is open, it only drives the two groups apart, the corporate side and the legacy side. And the legacy side is the quality side. And so having those two is really what needs to be a marriage. And, what I think this industry is about, and what we struggle with all the time, is that balance.
Yeah, it's like professionalism, but not at the expense of culture, right? Absolutely. You have to pay homage to the culture of what we're building here, and you can't stomp on the culture, right? So it's a respect. It's being that connective tissue between building a really professional business and a really regulated market, but also paying homage to the culture and not stomping that out.
Mm-hmm. So I know we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but looking out farther ahead, Max, if you were to have a crystal ball in your outlook for California, what do you see taking place over the next 36 months?
We're going to see continued consolidation. So either consolidation by, for revenue. So groups buying businesses to hit that top line, revenue number, or it's going to be continued consolidation for survival. I'm seeing that a lot too, right? Where you have independent businesses that have traditionally had egos and want to do everything themselves, but then saying, you know what, if we want to compete with these larger businesses, we're going to have to band together, collaborate. and build a stronger business collectively. So I'm gonna continue. We're gonna continue to see different types of consolidation that will ultimately, I think, wash some people out, unfortunately, but also will create a stronger foundation within the state of California. I'm curious. It's interesting to see like all these MSOs just like haven't really like. There's a couple right that have dipped into Cali. I think they're just kind of like waiting and watching for things to shake out. And it is a knife fight, so they probably don't want to get burned or stabbed right now. So within the next, call it 12 to 24 months, you'll probably start to see some of these bigger MSOs start to make some bigger plays out in Cali. But ultimately, I'm really interested to see what happens with New York and how they start to build that industry. You see these ice cream trucks like parked on the side of Washington Square, like selling sour diesel ace and no enforcement. And I'm like, man, like you're going to bite yourself in the ass if you guys don't, at least give these guys a pathway to becoming licensed, right? Or it's going to be another California game where we're going to have to continue to compete with the legacy market or the traditional market. So, kind of interesting to see what happens with traditional market and Cali as well, and how maybe the reduction in taxes can kind of help us compete a little bit better there. I'm not a big one about enforcement, right? Enforcement to me is just, kind of going backwards, war on drug style. But like, if we can get the people that, are operating out of the shadows and incentivize them to do that, I think that's going to make for a much more healthy ecosystem.
What state do you think did it right? Who do you admire as far as regulation goes? Is there a single state that you saw that has really stood out to you?
I'm not as, to be honest with you guys, I'm not as versed just because I've been so knee deep in Cali, but I have friends operating in Michigan and they seem to be thriving in Michigan, and I'm not really, I just saw Detroit is now, looking at revisiting the ordinance around opening up recreational in that city. I like Michigan, if I'm being honest. A lot of these other markets, they seem to be just really monopolistic, right? So it's like, you're a brand that's part of a big vertical company. Are you really building a brand? Or are you just building a very kind of siloed supply chain that, you can sell into, right? So, I don't really deeply respect those markets, although the people that are in are probably doing really well for themselves, right? But as far as like the markets are concerned, I would say Michigan. I'm really excited to see what goes down with New Jersey. Although I just saw a headline that like no Black-owned business operators are licensed in New Jersey yet, which is a total travesty. You have New York, which I think is kind of going through a similar knife fight with some of the legacy operators or traditional operators. So we'll see how that all pans out. But I'm excited for like the free market type of structures, right? The ones where you have a lot of people that can participate, and because of that heightened participation, you're going to see a lot more creativity, right? And I think creativity is what's going to fuel the next phase of this thing.
Absolutely, man. I couldn't agree more. So I wanted to ask you, as we kind of wrap this thing up, who were some of the most crucial or influential people in your cannabis journey? Whether it was an older brother or a friend that really educated you or put you on.
Yeah, so I would say the influence to me is probably one of my best friends, Max, who I mentioned earlier in the podcast, right? The guy that really stuck his neck out, took some risks early in his career, and I really admired that. He was a guy that never took the corporate train. He was the guy that said, how do I live a good life and bring weed to the people, right? And he's been doing that since 2008, 2009, right? When I was still slanging bonds at JP Morgan, right? So it was really admiring to see him do that as I was having this kind of tormenting existence in my other job. And he was, I think, a huge influence as to like how I could really break away and start doing something on my own. So I would say Max, my boy Maxie, I'll send him the podcast so he feels warm and fuzzy, but you guys will meet him too one day. He's salt of the earth, one of the greatest dudes in the world. And I'm godfather to his son. So it's a pretty incredible journey we've been on together.
That's awesome, man. So before I get into our last questions, I wanted to ask you, you're a dad of two, super busy guy. I see you outdoors all the time. How are you incorporating cannabis into your life?
Great question. For one, weed has made me a better father. I am way better of a father when I'm smoking herb. And because what herb does for me, like I'm not like you, JMO, where like I can't smoke a ton of weed and do work. Like for me, weed is to separate from work, right? It keeps me incredibly present. And real quick story. I was having a really stressful day, and it was like a Monday, right? Monday afternoon, kind of dusky side of the night, right? And normally when I'm stressed, I'm like, let's dig into the stress, let's solve issues. But that time I was, no, man, I'm gonna smoke something right here. So I went out on my porch and I started lighting this joint, and I just settled into the session. I was being completely present. I was just like in the zone. It was like bird sanctuary. You hear all the birds singing. And I look up, the wind changes, and there's a fucking endangered spotted owl sitting in my tree staring at me. And I'm just like, this is it. This is it. Like, whenever you're stressed, go light a joint, be present, or you'll miss shit like that. And that happened September. Whenever I'm feeling stressed, I turn right to cannabis to become present, to be there for that moment. And that's really what's helped me with my kids too, because too often you can get caught up in what's going on in work. You got your phone, you're checking emails. When I smoke weed, I'm not doing that. I'm literally with my human offspring, enjoying the moment.
That's awesome.
I love that. That's a great story.
So
I got one more question before we get to wrapping up. Max, what would you say would be like 3 words of wisdom or pieces of advice for people looking to get into the cannabis industry?
Looking to get into the cannabis industry, like, don't be afraid to look at the cannabis industry, because it is, from a cultural standpoint, it feels like it's a good old club. Like you gotta know someone to get in. But the reality is, like, everyone has value right now in this industry. We are literally building this supply chain from the ground up, right? So if you worked in CPG, or you worked, in hospitals or whatever, there's going to be applications that you can take from those industries and apply to cannabis. Maybe we don't know how they're applied yet, but they can be applied somewhere, right? So I think, if folks are trying to break into the industry, really knowing, your strong suits, your value, and then just trying to find the right business, the right vertical within the chain that translates the best. And then once you get in, man, it's like you can navigate. You can navigate. If you work hard in this industry, you can navigate, to retail. You can navigate back to cultivation, to, downstream to distribution. Like there's all sorts of application. And people just maybe don't know that, or are nervous about what that translation looks like. But human capital is the most powerful capital in cannabis right now. So if you bring passion to what you do, you're going to bring value to a cannabis business.
Perfect answer. Thank you.
I always tell people, if you really, really want to be in cannabis and you really want to be a grower, and there's no grower opportunities, just write that down, put it in your pocket, and then get any job in cannabis. And within 6 months, you can probably be a grower, because the once you're in this industry, you meet more people, and you get tapped in, and you find out where the opportunities are, and the amount of opportunity to advance is vast. So I think that
it's an industry that really allows you to follow your nose. Like if you want to, if you make the decision to follow your nose and your passion, the doors are there.
Yeah. I mean, I look back on how I swindled my way into Wall Street. It was just like going into the office and being like, give me a broom. I mean, it was like, I'll take a janitorial position to get through the door here. So it's just like, devoting your passion to whatever that first gig is. And then, given how fast things move, like people navigate. people navigate. It's so powerful to see people in large positions now that a year ago were, selling jewelry or something. It's just like, it's really fascinating to see the rise of people just around grit and around just being passionate and adding value.
Does the advice change at all, Max, for people in the industry looking to advance themselves?
It does a little bit, right? Because now you've had the experience, right? So it's then deciding like how you want to broaden that cannabis skill set, right? So like I'm deep in distro, right? I'm deep in distro, which is actually kind of a really great place to be because I have retail and I have brand, right? So I'm like in the middle of those things. So distribution is a really fascinating place to live because you have this kind of 360 view of the whole industry. You're touching everything. But as far as people within the industry, it's just similar in that you leverage those skills to maybe go attack a new vertical. So if you're, really good at manufacturing, then maybe you're going to be good at, inventory at a retail institution. There's all sorts of like comparisons. And I think in this industry, it is so complex that even that knowledge in one vertical will have application to, other verticals. So that's what I would say about, moving kind of, however you move, it's just kind of picking the right opportunity.
I'd agree with that. Max, where can people reach you? Where can people find you at on IG and on online? How can people get to you?
Cool. So yeah, we have a website for the business called We Are WOVN, WOVN. We did the trendy removal of the vowel. So if you guys care about that. So wearewoven.com, We Are Woven at We Are Woven distro is our Insta handle. If you want to see, what I'm up to on a daily or weekend basis, that's Cool Face is my IG handle. Follow me up and I'll DM you back. I like to have some fun on there. So yeah, those are the ways to find me.
Awesome, man.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Max, thank you so much. That was really great. Really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, and I would say like, I meet a lot of different people on my cannabis journey. Met you guys and automatically hit it off. You guys are like brothers to me. Like, and we've known each other for, less than 6 months. So it's really a powerful thing, this plant bringing these types of people together. Like, I'm super stoked to be on this show, and, thanks for even thinking of me. It's really, really nice of you guys.
Absolutely, bro.
So nice, Max. Right back at you, man. For sure. Awesome. Thank you.
Have a good day, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Talk soon. See ya.